Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. The trade war between China and the U.S. has dragged on for 15 months. Tariffs have been levied on billions of dollars worth of each other's goods. Uncertainty over when the conflict might be resolved has roiled markets and the global supply chain. U.S. President Donald Trump recently waved an olive branch to China, getting hopes up for signing a Phase 1 trade deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Despite a positive momentum, there are still American scholars who view relations as a zero-sum game between China and the United States, and one of them is John Mearsheimer, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Earlier, I had an insightful discussion, / debate on some of the key issues around China-U.S. relations with the professor. Let's listen in. Professor Mearsheimer, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
I'm glad to be here.
I heard you enjoy your time this time in China.
I always enjoy my time in China. I enjoy speaking to Chinese students and to Chinese scholars.
Of course, you're involved in a lot of debate without a result.
Yes, I've had quite a few debates. I've had a lot of back and forth with the students and the scholars. You know, people asking me tough questions about my arguments and having an opportunity to respond to them. And I enjoy this thoroughly.
Do you think the president that you have right now is serving exactly the purpose that you argued in your theory?
It's very hard to categorize him as following any particular theory.
But the result is very similar.
I think that's true in part, but I think that my argument was that the United States has to be mainly concerned with China as a military threat, as a security threat, and that the United States would engage in containment, much like it did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But in this case, right, I think with President Trump, it's largely, if not almost completely, economic. He's a businessman. He likes to do deals. And his basic view is that the Chinese have been beating the Americans economically. They've been beating them at business deals over time.
We heard that over and over again, but the question really is, and many wonder, Professor Mearsheimer, is it healthy to have one aspect of the relationship be the dominating voice of the overall nature of this relationship? Now, many argue both here in Beijing and in Washington that national security has become the top priority about everything, even sacrifice the other factors for the sake of the so-called national security. And sometimes the insecurity is relatively imagined than reality. So what do you make of it?
I think that's just the way the world works. I think that any time you have a country like the United States, that is the most powerful country in the world, and a country like China comes along and it begins to rise, and it looks like it might be able someday to challenge the United States. It might become as powerful as the United States. The United States will go to great lengths to prevent China from being an equal. And China, on the other hand, has a vested interest in not only being an equal to the United States, but being even more powerful than the United States. So a competition sets in, and that competition is in large part a security competition, and it can get quite ugly.
Are you feeding the rise of nationalism on both sides? Are you feeding, Professor Mearsheimer, some would accuse you of, that you are trying to fire up the so-called hostile forces from both sides toward one another and try to provide rationale to them?
No, not at all. I'm just telling people what I think is going to happen. And if people think I'm wrong, that's fine, and they'll have an opportunity to show why I'm wrong. I'm a structuralist. I believe that the structure of the international system forces states to behave in particular ways. I believe that the United States went to great lengths to dominate the Western Hemisphere because for security purposes, for the survival of the United States, it paid to be the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. I think from China's point of view, the best possible situation would be to be a regional hegemon in Asia, to push the Americans out of the Western Pacific to be by far the most powerful state in Asia. Why? Because that would be the best way for China to survive. But the problem is the Americans have a vested interest in making sure that China doesn't become a regional hegemon. So that's what sets this competition off. And it's not that China or the United States are behaving in immoral or stupid ways. It just makes sense, given the structure of the international system, for China and for the United States to want to dominate their respective regions of the world and make sure the other doesn't dominate its respective region.
What you have said, Professor Mearsheimer, and the debate you have created as a result of the theory is a thought-provoking one, because people really need to think about these questions profoundly and need to search for evidence and also think about what kind of solutions if they want to avoid the worst outcome in the future. But on the other hand, Professor, I have to also inform you that some been trying to take advantage of your theory or theories similar to that of yours in, shall we say, in both cultures, trying to stimulate further conflicts and escalate it even to an extent that the current stage actually do not necessarily has to see. What do you make of that?
I think that there's no question that there are going to be some people who believe what I have to say. That's going to influence their thinking, and therefore they are going to go out and push either the United States or China to behave in ways that I advocate.
It's getting worse as a result.
Yes, but my argument is that it's not because of my rhetoric. It's because of the structure of the international system. If I didn't exist, it wouldn't matter.
But on the other hand, I keep on asking this very similar question to you, Professor Mearsheimer. That is, why do you think people have to stand in line to say to themselves, now security is the priority? Why do you think there shouldn't be an opportunity for people to think maybe more interactions between the two countries is the top priority? Why do you think interactions will not necessarily lead to solutions, but rather decoupling and getting ever worse situation between two countries will lead us to the solutions? That just is not very rational to me.
No, I actually believe it's very rational. I think it's a very depressing story. And I think that's what bothers you about my story. It is so depressing.
I'm not bothered. I'm rather seeing it's very partial, that you only focus on one area, the security area, which you are very familiar with, forgetting about the other areas which is equally important. For example, trade, which has brought China to a very different development stage. I'm not sure whether your experiences have been feeding you to one aspect of the argument without necessarily having enough insights on the other sides of the argument.
Well, I fully understand that all of this economic intercourse over the past 30 or so years between China and the United States has had very positive consequences for both the United States and for China. I fully understand that. But the problem is that as a result of all of this economic intercourse, China is growing increasingly powerful, and it's closing the power gap with the United States.
Why is it a problem?
For one very simple reason. It involves security. And what I think you don't understand is that security or survival has to be the principal goal of any country. Any Chinese leader or American leader has to be mainly concerned.
Is there common security?
No.
Is there only security for one without the others?
Yes, my point to you is that as China gets more powerful, it becomes a zero-sum game.
Why would it become a zero-sum game? Only you are saying it's a zero-sum game. You're
No.
exactly advocating a zero-sum game,
No.
while China has been saying it is not. We hope it is not, and we're trying to do in a way that it's not. But now,
Of course.
everything wants to be cut off. You cut off trade, you decouple. Of course, it's going to the direction that you have already planned. You here, I do not necessarily refer to you yourself, but rather who try to cut the relationship in one direction without giving other options and possibility.
The point is that economic growth can be translated into military power.
It can, but it does not necessarily lead to war or even regional conflict. That is the point.
Again, I don't know what I can do to convince you.
You're not convincing me, Professor.
No, I understand that. But all I would say to you is you have watched U.S.-China relations deteriorate since 2011 when Hillary Clinton announced the pivot to Asia.
Various times when U.S.-China relations, as young as I am, experienced difficult times, from 1989 to other 1990, the collision and various forms. Of course, you could argue China was at a very different stage then compared to now, but people then had the wisdom and also the resolve to be able to see that the relationship continue in a healthy way.
Yes, but the balance of power has fundamentally changed. We are in a different world today, and China is getting to the point where it's almost as powerful as the United States. And once that happens, in my opinion, it's inevitable that security competition is going to set in. Why did you get a pivot to Asia in 2011 and not in 2001 and not in 1991? You got a pivot to Asia in 2011 because the United States was beginning to get really scared about Chinese economic growth.
Well, Professor, I'm afraid you are using the result to describe the reason of the issue. You got a pivot to Asia as a result of some fear in the United States about China. I'm not sure that fear is necessarily coming from the business community. I'm not sure that fear is really necessarily coming from students that are in Chinese university from the United States, for example, that are studying here. It is coming from politicians. This is exactly what we're talking about. Politicians are defining the relationship with use of geopolitics.
That may be true, but politicians run countries. And if politicians define the relationship...
There have been a lot of failed leadership in our history, and those failed leadership have been thrown away by history. For example, if you look at the end of the Second World War, it takes real leadership, not one that is blaming the other side in order to get a buying of time. It takes real leadership and quality of leadership to do the right thing. Those leaders that are not in a position will eventually be get rid of by history. As simple as that. That's also a theory.
See, I think that real leadership or high-quality leadership means recognizing the importance of the balance of power and going to great lengths to make sure that you maximize how much power your country has.
What about global governance? What about the responsible stakeholders? Many of the other advocates of their own theories have also been talking about that why can't China and the United States be responsible stakeholders, but rather be the narrow themselves, only thinking about how can I beat up the other side. There are so many things. If you think about technology, it is already in a brand new stage of technology, and one kind of progress could totally mean a different nature even of human being. If you look at the gene technology, if you look at the artificial intelligence as well, it's common threats and challenge to human beings. Don't you think China and the United States could grasp this opportunity and do something together as they did 40 years ago, a common threat, so-called?
No, I don't. And I think all this talk about global governance and responsible stakeholders doesn't mean very much. The problem in the international system is that there is no government that's above states. There's no higher authority. That means that China has to take care of itself. In international relations theory, we say it's a self-help world. China has to take care of its own interests. The United States has to take care of its own
Even
interests.
borrowing your self-help world theory, countries, even with their own interests in mind, of course they always have their national interests in mind when it comes to diplomacy, but they could still find common ground because there are common threats.
They can find common ground on some issues, but on the major security issues, there is hardly any common ground.
As devastating, some would say, that your theory is, there are still things that both sides can do to manage the relationship, to make sure it's not sliding down the slope that you described. Anything to do?
I do believe, as I've said on numerous occasions here, that I believe there will be an intense security competition, but there will not necessarily be a shooting war. I think what we have to do, both the Chinese side and the American side, is over the course of this competition, go to great lengths to manage it.
How?
Well, we have to think about clearly what one state does that will provoke another state and avoid doing that. And if we get into a crisis, we have to have clear rules about how to communicate with each other and do everything possible to dampen down the conflict and prevent it from escalating.
But since security is the priority, you already see some of the people that need to urgently talk to one another from both sides are not talking anymore. That is the danger of decoupling, no communication, talking across each other rather than real communication.
But I think the key issue here is that, as I've said on a number of occasions, survival is the principal goal of each state. And you want to understand that when you talk about the United States and China, you're talking about two countries with nuclear weapons. And if a crisis turns into a war, there's always a danger that that will escalate into a nuclear war. And the survival of each of those states could be threatened. So we have a deep-seated interest in managing a crisis to prevent a war from breaking out, and certainly to prevent that war from escalating to the nuclear level.
But all the previous mechanism between China and the United States at this moment, particularly the dialogues, the discussions, the platforms, have been almost all scrapped off at this moment. So how can there be a trust, at least, to be able to work, at least, on certain topics together?
I agree with that, and I think what has to be done always in the early stages of a competition is that rules of the road have to be established. Understandings have to be established. That has not happened yet. And that's why one could argue, as was the case in the Cold War, the early stages of a competition between the United States and China will be the most dangerous because there are not clear rules of the road. They haven't been worked out
But
yet.
the rules of the world now is being questioned with the United States going unilateralism and also trying to withdraw with as many international organizations and treaties as possible in this administration. So how could you have what you have just said, the rules and the common rules and the respect for the common rules, not to mention the rules really need to be updated and in many new fields as well, but there's nothing about that. It's all about decoupling thanks to your theory that the two countries are going to be competitors in a very hostile way.
Well, I don't think it's thanks to my theory. It's thanks to the fact that the world is changing. You want to remember that during the Cold War...
So how about the rules? Where to cite the rules, where to set the rules, and how to establish the rules?
Well, the United States and China will maneuver with each other, and they will establish rules of the road as to what's acceptable and what's unacceptable.
When you see your grandchildren, what kind of world would you like to describe to them that they are likely to face? What kind of world would you wish your grandchildren to have?
I would wish that they would live in a very peaceful world where there's no more threat of climate change, where there's no more threat of a major disease sweeping across the planet. I think what I would wish for is the same thing that you would wish for. I don't think that's likely to happen. And when I look at my grandchildren and look at my children, it makes me kind of sick to my stomach to think about where the world is headed, both in terms of security competition involving countries like China and the United States, and we haven't even talked about Russia, which is another player in this game. And when I think about all the crazy wars that the United States has fought in the Middle East and all the murder and mayhem that we've created there, that disturbs me. And the whole subject of climate change and where that's leading is very disturbing. So I am not very optimistic about the future, and I wish I could be.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Inside CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Time to take it easy. The weekend is here, so enjoy. See you back here on Monday.